past few weeks. At least a little. She'd had some federal rations brought in by the Red Cross and the FEMA people, so the MREs were still a once-in-a-while thing for her. If not a treat exactly, they were at least rare enough to still seem like a novelty. The little bottles of Tabasco sauce, for example, were just plain cute. But of course, Jim and Madison were sick of them. For the two of them, opening an MRE meant dragging themselves back to the trough. It meant drudgery. It meant sameness. It meant morale-sucking boredom. And so, when Madison had referred to the MREs as meals rejected by Ethiopians, Eleanor had nearly choked on the Welsh rarebit she was eating. "Don't be nasty," she said. "What a horrible thing to say." But then she saw the wry smile on her husband's face, and the way he nodded in agreement with their daughter's complaint, and she realized that they had bonded, that they belonged together. "They have a special power when they're together," she thought, and she was momentarily confused by the conflicting envy and joy the thought brought her. "The two of them are crazy and wonderful and a little frightening sometimes. Yet together they are powerful." And they were hers. That felt good. The rain stopped shortly after daybreak, and they got going. The air was dense and humid, and though it wasn't hot yet, by mid-morning the heat would be oppressive. Already the air hummed with insects, mosquitoes mostly, and the volunteers and the Nortons and Hank Gleason grumbled as they swatted at the pests. They paddled down flooded streets between ruined buildings, marveling at how much damage the storms had done. Nothing had escaped the storm's destructive power. Every billboard they passed had sections hanging loose from the frame or blown out entirely, and so many buildings had burned. This, Eleanor remembered from her many briefings at the EOC, was an inevitable consequence of people forgetting to turn off the gas before the storm, despite the numerous warnings on the news and on the radio. It looked to Eleanor that some of those buildings must have blown sky high, judging from the burned bits of lumber floating down the street. There were plastic toys everywhere, because they too floated. A shutter banged open and closed in the breezeway created by a roofless house. Somewhere a dog howled. In the distance they could see a swarm of seagulls feeding on something, but they were too far away to see exactly what, and Eleanor didn't really want to know anyway. The water was full of debris and dead animals, and sometimes even dead people. But there were living people wandering around too. That alarmed Eleanor at first, because she was still rattled by the zombies they'd seen at the Meadow Lakes Business Park. But the people who were out now were clearly not zombies, even though they moved like people did in her nightmares. They seemed lost, disconnected from each other and their own fates. They were shiny with sweat, their faces traumatized, their clothes torn to rags. The city and the people who haunted it seemed to her to have taken on an otherworldly appearance that Eleanor found more and more claustrophobic as the day wore on. They passed a man seated on some kind of large board he'd put between the hoods of two pickups. As they drew closer, a hush fell over the flotilla of canoes. Now, passing directly in front of the man, Eleanor could see the board was the front door of the house behind him. He was holding the drowned body of a child, a boy not much older than Madison. The man's eyes were very white against the filth that covered his face. Hank pulled his canoe up to the man, and spoke so quietly to him that Eleanor couldn't hear what was said. The man made no attempt to answer. Hank turned back to the group and caught Eleanor's gaze. He shook his head as though to say the man was lost to the world. They saw looters who didn't even try to disguise what they were doing. Water moccasins moved like ribbons in the wind as they glided out from fallen trees. Eleanor saw dead bodies floating like driftwood, while not 5 feet away 2 men and a woman ate from a jar of mayonnaise they'd found somewhere. A helicopter passed overhead, and though they tried to flag it down, it never even slowed. "Don't do any good to flag them down," Hank said, gliding up next to their canoe. "That was the National Guard. They don't stop any more." "Why not?" Jim asked. "Too many looters. Too many people shooting at the looters. I've talked to their pilots. They don't want to fly into a situation and get shot by the people they are trying to save. I can't really blame them, I guess." "So what good do they do? Why the flyovers?" "I guess so they can report what they see." "To who? If they're not going to help, who is?" Hank shrugged. "Don't know." They all grew quiet. "What's wrong, Hank?" Eleanor asked suddenly. He looked at her, surprised. "Ma'am?" "You've been acting down since we saw that man with the dead boy. Are you okay?" A wan smile danced at the corners of his mouth, and in that instant Eleanor saw the stunning good looks that made all the women in the department sigh whenever Hank walked by. He really was a heartbreaker. "Just wondering what's going to happen to us," he said, gesturing at the destruction around them with a vague wave of his hand. "After all this is over." "We'll get through it. We'll start over." "No, ma'am," he said, after a long, thoughtful silence. "No, ma'am, I don't think that'll happen." "Why the change in attitude, Hank? Last night and yesterday, you didn't seem to have doubts at all." He smiled. "Yeah, funny how that'll happen to a guy." He paddled on, occasionally glancing back at the rest of the volunteers, making sure they were all still together. He was silent for so long that Eleanor thought that was all he was going to say. But when he spoke again, it was as though he hadn't paused at all. "It's just, all this stuff is gone now. Houston, I mean. I lived my whole life here. I don't know how to begin starting over, you know?" "Yeah," Eleanor said. "Yeah, I know." When she was 17, Eleanor lost her grandmother. Or rather, her grandmother had simply died. Eleanor didn't really lose anyone, as her mother hadn't spoken with her parents in a dozen years or more. She had only the vaguest memories of her maternal grandparents, and at the time she'd had absolutely no clue as to why they'd dropped out of her parents' life, and not enough sense to ask. But Eleanor was eager to meet her grandfather, even under the sad circumstances. Unfortunately, the man she ended up meeting was a broken one. If he had been a bad father to Eleanor's mother, he had evidently been a loving husband to her grandmother, and over the course of the week they spent together, Eleanor watched the man fall apart. He barely spoke to any of them, but he had said something to Eleanor that had mystified her at the time. "Our lives," he said, "are like a junkyard tumbling down the stairs. We have no control over what happens. There's no master plan. We just exist until eventually it all comes crashing down." Now, many years later, Eleanor understood the awful power of that nihilistic urge. She saw how strongly it called to the weary and the destitute, as though it had its own gravity. And if it could absorb Hank, who was blessed with so much and treated life with such simple, boyish joy, none of them were immune. And then, almost as if he were responding to a movie director's cue, a man floated around the corner on a rickety pool chair, singing, "Bye, bye, Miss American Pie, drove my Chevy to the levee, but the levee was dry." The man was bare-chested and righteously drunk. He had an igloo cooler tied to the back of the chair, and the 2 remaining beers of a six-pack hanging from the chair's headrest. One of the Red Cross volunteers began to chuckle, and Eleanor did too. Someone called out to him, asking him if he wanted a ride. He looked at the long row of canoes as though startled, breaking off his song mid-verse. Then his smile grew large again, and he raised his beer high and began to sing, his voice loud and off-key, and not at all sane. "Them good old boys were drinking whiskey and rye, singing, 'This'll be the day that I die.'" Eleanor and the others stopped paddling and turned to watch him float by, the chair keeping a surprisingly straight course through the current. He raised the beer to them one last time and sang, "This'll be the day that I die." Jim shook his head. "I think he's right. Zombies'll get him before nightfall," Hank agreed. He looked around at the others. "Anybody need to stop for a rest?" Nobody did. "All right, then. Let's keep going." Later that afternoon, they arrived at the I-45 junction with Spur 5 on the northeast corner of the University of Houston's campus. Eleanor, looking at a sea of burned and mutilated bodies, tried not to gag. Others weren't so strong. She could hear them vomiting over the sides of their canoes, then muttering apologies to those around them. As they drifted closer to what had been the EOC's boatyard, they began to hear moans coming from some of the bodies, and Madison clapped her hands over her ears to keep the sounds away. "What happened here?" Eleanor asked Hank. He scanned the campus and the floating field of burned bodies, and he said, "I don't know. You can see where a lot of these buildings are burned, but I don't think that's what did this to these people." "Do you think these were people from the shelters?" "Ma'am, I ain't got the foggiest idea. It's quiet now, though. Either everybody left or—" "Or they're all dead," Madison said sharply. He looked at her, not unkindly, then nodded. "Yeah, I'm afraid so." "What are we going to do?" Madison said, looking from one adult to the next. "Well, if they are not here, one of two things must have happened," Hank said. "One, they got evacuated, which doesn't seem real likely. Or two, they went somewhere else to get evacuated. We need to figure out where." "Okay, great. How are we going to do that?" Eleanor asked. "I went to every EOC meeting for the last 5 weeks, and they never mentioned going anywhere specific to get evacuated. They threw out some suggestions, but nothing was ever decided on." He shrugged. "I think I know where they went to," Jim said. They all turned and stared at him. "Look there," he said, and pointed at the wall of the rec center. "See it? Just above the waterline?" Eleanor followed the line of his finger, and when she saw what he was pointing at, she laughed. "Yeah," she said, "I see it." Written in black paint that had started to run like the print on a horror movie poster were the words, "Order to evacuate. Proceed to Sam Houston Race Park." "Huh," Hank said. "Well, I guess that answers that." "Oh, man," Jim said. "You cops are something else. It's a wonder you ever solve any crimes at all." "Cute," Eleanor said. "Thanks for the support there, hubby." "My pleasure," he said, smiling at her. And then Hank rapped his knuckles against the side of their canoe. "Ma'am, check that out over there. See him on top of that wall there?" He was pointing at a dead man in tattered green BDU pants. His chest was laced with cuts and deeper wounds, like teeth marks. Someone had made an effort to cover him with a blanket, but the wind had blown that away, so that now it hung from the spot where it was still tucked under his legs. The man was big, heavy-set, and there was a bullet hole in his forehead. For a second, Eleanor thought it was Captain Shaw, but the man was too young, his hair still black. "Is that—" she asked. "Yeah, I think so." "But we just saw them last night. He was with Anthony and that other guy." "Yep," Hank said. Funny how things work out, ain't it? Chapter 16. What Mark Shaw had wanted most after shooting his son was to dig a grave. Overcome with grief and rage, he'd wanted to slice the earth open with a shovel, tear into it, perform some violent, destructive act that would absorb all his fury. But he had wanted the work of digging, too. In a strange way that he didn't completely comprehend, the digging would be both a destructive act and at the same time a creative one. It was the destruction he wanted, but it was the creative act he knew he needed. He needed to sweat. He needed to feel the muscles in his arms and his back burn with exertion. He needed to feel the blisters form and burst on his palms, because these things would honor his son. Self-flagellation would be the last act of love he could ever do for the boy. But in a world covered by water, graves were impossible, and he had been forced to leave Brent on top of the wall where he died, covered by a yellow tarp. He had carefully tucked the corners under the body, and then sat back in a small boat that he had claimed for his own. And while the rest of the refugees filed out of the boatyard, Mark Shaw watched the tarp flutter in the breeze, and thought of Brent. Not as he had been there at the end, perpetually drunk and scared, but as the 4-year-old boy who would sometimes come downstairs in the middle of the night to crawl into bed between his parents. It was funny, he thought, how memory grabbed on to the littlest moments, the ones that simply are, the ones without a beginning or an end. Like the feeling of letting go the day he taught Brent to ride a bike, watching as he wobbled slowly down the sidewalk, or driving him to school in the morning, that little boy's smile of his, no front teeth and full of radiant joy, or watching football with him on the couch on Sunday afternoons, or teaching him to shoot. But he remembered these things, too. The chemical stench of the floodwaters, burning buildings glowing against a nighttime sky, Brent standing in the smoke-covered water, holding the AR-15 across his chest, trembling, unable to speak, unable to move. The city, drowned and quiet, and every bit as desolate as the Jerusalem of Jeremiah's visions, shimmering in the light of the rising sun. The faces of refugees, shocked and exhausted, as the boats carried them away. Zombies. His son, so much like him, dying on top of a wall. Anthony saying, "Dad, he was supposed to run straight to you. He would have been safe if he'd just done it like I told him." Anthony saying, "Dad?" Anthony saying, "Dad, say something, please." Later, Mark Shaw sat in the same little metal boat he'd been in when he said goodbye to Brent, bringing up the rear of the ragtag fleet of refugee boats. He was exhausted from fighting all night long. He was emotionally drained by his grief and his rage. The droning of the little .25 Johnson outboard was trying to put him to sleep. The only thing keeping him awake now was willpower. From his position at the back, he had a clear view of the rest of the fleet, some 400-plus boats of every make and degree of seaworthiness. His best guess was that they had gotten away with fewer than 3,000 of the original 80,000 who had grouped together at the campus. Those few survivors were jammed into the boats now. Some boats were so overloaded that people were forced to hang over the sides, making them look, to Shaw, like those trains in India and Bangladesh with the natives spilling out like candy from a piñata. From somewhere up ahead, he heard people yelling and a woman crying. Shaw looked around for one of his officers, but none of them were close by. After the battle at the campus, he had only 6 left, and all of them were busy sprinting up and down the line, shepherding the fleet. Shaw fed the engine a little more throttle and sped up to the disturbance. The yelling was coming from a white Maxim runabout with an open bow and yellow trim on the stern. Several younger men were trying to heave the body of a dead man over the side of the boat, while a wild-eyed woman tried desperately to stop them. One of the men pushed the woman down, but she got right back up and wrapped an arm around the dead man's neck.
"Let go of him!" she screamed. "You fucking bastards! Don't you touch him!"
"Hey!" Shaw said. They didn't hear him. Another of the men tried to pull the woman's arm loose, and when that didn't work, he balled his fist and made to punch her in the face.
"Hey!"
Shaw said. The man hesitated, his fist hovering above the woman's wildly rolling eyes and terrified grimace. He and the rest of the men looked over the side and into the barrel of Shaw's Glock. "You hit her, son, and I'll put a bullet in your head." One of the other men reached for a shotgun, but only got it halfway up before Shaw covered him with a pistol. "Don't be stupid," he said. "Go on, put it down. That's it. Okay, everybody, hands where I can see 'em. Just like that. Perfect. Now how about one of you guys tell me what's going on here?" They all yelled at him at once, and Shaw held up a palm to silence them. He felt tired and, in a crazy sort of way, bored. "One at a time," he said, and pointing at the man who'd been trying to pick up the shotgun. "You! What are you guys doing?" The man looked to be barely 20 years old. He was thin and rough-looking, like a South Houston redneck meth head, tattoo sleeves that curled up to his neck. "This dude just died," he said. His tone suggested that that was all there was to say on the matter, and the others seemed to agree, for they were nodding in agreement. "Okay," Shaw said. "What did he die of?"
"How the fuck should I know? I look like a doctor to you?"
Shaw laughed. "No, son, you definitely don't look like a doctor to me."
"He's gonna turn into one of them zombies. I don't want no fucking zombies on this boat."
The others all started talking at once, but Shaw didn't try to silence them this time. What was happening here was pretty plain now. He could tell them that the zombies were diseased living people, not the walking dead like in the movies. But what was the point? None of them would listen or understand if they did. And besides, there was an easier solution to the problem. "Hand 'em down to me." That silenced them. They looked at Shaw, and then at each other. "Come on, we're wasting daylight. Hand 'em down." The woman, whose panic had flared again, said,
"No, he's not going to change into one of them. He's not infected."
"Ma'am," Shaw said patiently. "Ma'am." The woman looked at him, her chest heaving. "I know that. I'm going to put him in this boat. I got room for both of you. You can tend to your husband while I steer."
"He's my brother,"
she said. "Okay, your brother. The two of you can ride with me." The wild fear cooled in her eyes. She looked at the men in the boat with her, and then down at the corpse. She swallowed hard and began to cry. "Hurry it up," Shaw said to the men. "Hand 'em down to me." They did as he asked, moving the body and helping the woman down to him in silence. "You okay?" he said to the woman. She was sitting against the gunwale, her brother's head in her lap. She shook her head, but said nothing. "Hold on to something." And with that he turned the boat away from the men aboard the Maxim, and resumed his place at the fleet's rear. For the third time in an hour, Mark Shaw saw a Coast Guard helicopter fly overhead. They were crisscrossing back and forth over northwest Houston, and probably elsewhere, too, announcing the military-run evacuation point at the Sam Houston Race Park. Shaw stood up in the boat and looked around for landmarks he recognized. In the distance, he could see the elevated sprawl of the Beltway, which meant they were almost there. "Shouldn't be too much longer," he said to the woman, who still cradled her dead brother's head in her lap. She stared at him, her eyes hollow and miserable-looking behind the stringy curtain of her hair. He had taken her aboard 3 hours earlier. and though he had tried to ask her name several times, she'd refused to say anything to him. She was, he feared, shutting down mentally. Many of the refugees were. A few minutes later, he saw Anthony's boat speeding back to him. Anthony was behind the wheel, while Jesse rode in the front with an AR-15. Shaw had assigned the two of them to ride point for the fleet, and if they were coming back to the rear now, it meant something was happening. Shaw slowed his boat to a stop. "What's going on?" he said. Anthony looked at the woman and the dead man curiously, as though he wanted to ask where they came from, but decided better of it. He turned to his father, and then quickly looked down at his own hands on the wheel. He was too ashamed to meet his father's gaze. That much was obvious, and Shaw thought that was probably just as well. If he got too close to Anthony right now, he might punch his lights out. The anger was still fresh, still very raw. Anthony said, "There's some activity on the other side of the Beltway. Hand him the binoculars, Jesse." Jesse reached into one of the storage bins and handed the binoculars over to Shaw, who took them without comment. "Where?" he asked. "Over there," Anthony said, and pointed past the Beltway. "It's all around over there. Look anywhere." To the naked eye, it was just a long, shimmering line against the water. Shaw hadn't thought twice about it when he first noticed it, thinking that maybe it was just a trick of the light on the water. But now that he was looking at it through the binoculars, he could see what it was. A chain-link fence. An enormous chain-link fence that stretched for miles. "I've seen soldiers patrolling outside it," Anthony said. "They've also put up some barriers at the base of the fence and wrapped everything in barbed wire." Shaw lowered the binoculars. "Those crazy bastards. They're building a wall around the city." He shook his head in disbelief. "What do you want to do, Dad?" "The plan hasn't changed. Get us to the Beltway. I want to find the on-ramp closest to the military's evacuation point and get us up there. Once you find the on-ramp, start forming these people up and working them through." Anthony nodded. "Go on," Shaw said. "Yes, sir." Anthony turned his boat around and glided off, so as not to create a wake around his father's much smaller craft. When he was gone, Shaw raised the binoculars again and studied the fence. "Those crazy bastards," he muttered. They reached the Beltway a little before 1 o'clock that afternoon. Shaw sped up and down the line of the fleet, watching as his officers helped civilians up the freeway on-ramp. He offered encouragement wherever he could, and for the first time in quite a while he saw smiles and an appearance of collective relief on the faces of the refugees he passed. They were here. They were finally getting out of this hellhole. He coasted over to the on-ramp and looked over the side. He could see the street below, and he guessed the water was about 4 feet deep. "Come on," he said to the woman. He climbed over the side, dropping into water that was up to his chest. "Where are we going?" she asked him. The sound of her voice surprised him. He looked back at her. "Ma'am, we have to leave here. There's a military checkpoint up at the top of this ramp. From there, to be honest, I don't know what will happen. But I do know that we have to leave now." "What about my brother?" He sighed. He'd known this moment was coming, but he hadn't wanted to think about it. "They won't let you bring a dead body through the checkpoint. I'm sorry." "You're sorry? You fucking asshole! This is my brother! I can't leave him here! I can't! I won't do that!" "Ma'am," he said, not unkindly, "I've brought you here to the way out. I can't make you go through it. That's going to have to be your choice, and yours alone. I know how hard this is. I understand." "You understand? Bullshit! Don't patronize me! You don't understand shit!" His control almost broke. He could feel his anger rising. He could feel his mouth starting to tremble, the tears threatening. Shaw hadn't wanted to cry, not yet, and certainly not in public. He knew he would eventually, but it would be on his own terms. "I lost my son back at the shelter," he said. That stopped her. She sucked in a ragged-sounding breath and stared at him. "It happened right before we got on the boats. He was bit by one of those zombies." Shaw made a vague gesture toward the holstered pistol on his hip. "I had to. It was really hard." His hands were shaking. He closed his eyes and balled his hands into fists. When he looked back at the woman, there were tears streaking down her cheeks. "You can go without him, or stay with him. I won't tell you which is best. To be honest, I don't know which is best. But I have a job to do, and right now that's all I've got. Good luck to you." And with that, he walked toward the ramp.
"Dad?"
Shaw stopped. Anthony and Jessie were standing in the bow of their boat about 20 feet away. Both looked worried. "I told you to help get people through the checkpoint."
"I know, Dad. That's what I wanted to talk to you about. Can we talk?"
It was an intensely hot day. The air had taken on an almost tropical steaminess, and Shaw, who could feel the sun burning the back of his neck, was feeling irritable and tired. "Make this quick," he said. Anthony glanced at Jessie, who quickly looked away, then at his father.
"We just came from up top, Dad. You should see it up there. It's crazy. All those people. And the military's only letting them through one at a time. There's no order."
"Anthony," Shaw said, cutting him off, "say whatever it is you need to say, but don't stand there fucking jerking my chain. Speak plainly."
"Okay. All right, Dad. As crazy as it is up there, we think this is our best chance to get out of here with the money. They're checking everybody over, making sure nobody's been infected, you know? But being who we are, we could get through there. With all that confusion up there, we could slip away and be 500 miles from here by nightfall. What do you say, Dad? You give the word. We'll be out of here in no time."
Shaw looked down at his hands. They were still trembling. Then he looked to the south, across hundreds of flooded homes. In the distance, he could see people coming. Not zombies, but people. Refugees like the ones he had risked everything to bring to this spot. He saw them carrying the remnants of their lives on their backs, whole families made transient. He listened. Above him, thousands of scared people were growing restless. A helicopter's rotors thrummed off into the distance. He mopped a hand across his face, wiping the sweat from his eyes. He found it difficult to put into words exactly what he was feeling. Right after his wife's funeral, after he was done with the etiquette of death, the inane process the living put themselves through to say goodbye to a life, he had gotten in his truck and driven north, eventually ending up on the shores of Lake Livingston. He had gone midway to Dallas, for Christ's sake, with no idea what he was doing or why he was doing it. So he'd stopped at the lake and gone down to the water's edge and looked out over a drab November day. The horizon had been a watercolor smear of rain clouds, laced with threads of blue lightning. He'd been thinking of Grace and of duty. He'd hated her for dying, for abandoning her family, and he had hated himself because he knew how unfair he was being. It was that same illogical hate that he was feeling now for Anthony. It wasn't the boy's fault, and he knew it. To Anthony, who was so perfect in so many ways, these storms, these zombies, this horrible, messed-up clusterfuck of a world were just bumps in the road. He wasn't connected to anything, certainly not the same sense of duty that governed Shaw's life, and for him life would go on. There were no wounds to heal because nothing cut him very deeply. How could it without a sense of duty? "Anthony," Shaw said, "I want you to take those duffel bags and stash them somewhere safe.
After that, you are to go topside and help get those people through the gate." "But, Dad—" "Do not talk back to me!" Shaw exploded. "Don't you fucking dare! You hear me, Anthony? Don't you fucking talk back to me. Boy, I don't think you have the first fucking clue about what's important in life. Maybe I've failed you. Maybe I assumed that you were so talented you would know these things without me teaching them to you. If so, that's my fault. But I'm going to rectify that right now." He turned to Jesse. "Jesse, I have no control over what you do. You're not mine. If you want to take your chances, if you want to abandon these people, go on. Take your share and get the fuck out." Jesse swallowed hard. "No, sir," he said. "I'll stay." "Yeah, well, okay then," Shaw said. "Good. At least one of you has got some sense of what's important." "Dad, come on, "No!" Shaw said. "No. You shut the fuck up. I don't want to hear you speak right now. You will listen. You will keep your mouth closed. No son of mine is going to creep away into the night like a thief. You got that? Your name is Shaw, and you will wear it proudly, for I worked hard to make it worth something. You hear me?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Now take those bags and stash them. Once you've done that, get your ass topside and you do your duty. You have taken an oath, and you will live up to it. You will keep the charge that you have asked for." He stared at them both, dared them to speak. Neither one did. "Better and better," he said. "Now get the fuck out of my sight." Anthony waded over to a red Toyota pickup. He remembered what had happened back at Canal Street when the water receded from the Volkswagen in which they'd originally stashed the money, leaving it in plain sight. He didn't want to take a chance like that again. This pickup was hidden between a school bus and an overturned 18-wheeler. No one would find it unless they were looking for it, so he figured it was safe. He popped the hood and put the duffel bags in with the engine. Then he waded back to the boat, and he and Jesse went to do their duty. Captain Shaw walked up the freeway on-ramp and emerged onto the elevated deck of the Sam Houston Tollway. The noise and the stench of filthy people was almost too much. They were refugees as far as he could see. The road was packed with them. There were babies screaming, injured people hobbling down the road as best they could. A few who couldn't walk moaned and begged for someone to help them. Older people mostly. Others just stared off into the unknown distance, their faces drawn, their eyes wide and vacant. One man was muttering madly as he swatted at invisible bees around his head. "This is the end," he said. "Gonna get us all, I know it! I know it!" Children cried and clutched at their parents when they saw him. One father threatened to toss the lunatic over the side, and a few others grumbled in approval. Shaw saw families with everything they owned stuffed into backpacks or wheelbarrows, or resting on top of doors they carried between them like stretchers. He was momentarily amazed at the number of little red wagons he saw. He didn't know they still made them. Anthony and Brent had one just like that when they were kids. He remembered pulling them around in it when they visited SeaWorld in San Antonio, and Brent, God, the kid had been crazy, wheeling down hills, his head thrown back while he screamed with delight, "Daddy, look at me! Whee!" The memory brought a smile, but it quickly faded. He turned and looked out over the flooded city. He counted at least 30 towering columns of black smoke in the distance. Sunlight dappled on the water, making it look like liquid silver. And there was a smell, too. He hadn't really noticed it when he was down in the boats, but up here, the chemical stench and sewer smell of mud were overpowering. In the near distance, he could see more refugees approaching the freeway. Few of them had boats, and the others were forced to swim,
for the water was a good 15 feet deep out there. He thought about sending some of his men out there with boats to pick them up, but he knew that wouldn't work. One of his officers, an older black patrolman named Garrity, was nearby, trying to help a woman with 3 crying kids find her missing son. Looking up and down the line of refugees, he could see his other officers were all trying to put out similar fires. They were every bit as exhausted as the people they were trying to help, and yet not one of them had quit. Not one of them had abandoned their post. Shaw was proud of his people. No one would be able to say that his men had shirked their duties. A black kid of about 16 waved Shaw down.
"Hey, man, how much longer they gonna make us wait? I'm fucking sick of standing in line."
"I have no idea how long you'll have to wait," Shaw told him.
"Yeah, well, you're the fucking law, ain't you? Why don't you get up there and find out?"
Shaw just stared at the kid. He didn't even have the desire to go over and slap his face, which was what the kid needed. It was what his whole generation needed. It didn't matter if they were black or white or Mexican. They all grew up with a sense of entitlement that was sickening. Everybody owed them something. They assumed they could talk to the law the same way they talked to their friends, because the world had gone soft and they knew it. Everything was tolerated, because nobody was at fault. And to think, this was the generation that was going to inherit a world full of zombies. Humanity is going to go extinct in less than 20 years, he thought bitterly. With little pieces of shit like that kid at the helm, we're doomed. But, like it or not, the kid had a point. The line didn't seem to be moving at all. People had dropped their backpacks, and they were sitting on them, shading themselves from the midday sun with whatever they had available. They looked tired and irritable and supremely bored. Shaw walked down the line toward the gateway. What he saw there was incredible. People were being led one by one into a sort of holding tank between 2 large chain-link fences that ran from one side of the road to the other. Soldiers in white plastic biohazard suits and gas masks pointed rifles at each refugee as they were led inside the holding area, stripped of every scrap of clothing they wore, and inspected from head to toe. If they refused to undress, they were turned away. There were no second chances, and no explanations were given. You either did as you were told the first time without complaint, or you were turned away. Shaw saw it happen twice. One woman, whether out of vanity or her own sense of entitlement, refused. She demanded to speak to the officer in charge. The soldiers pushed her back through the gate, and when she turned to scream at them, they raised their weapons at her face and ordered her to back away. Stunned and speechless, she just stood there, crying. Another woman was led inside. She had a dazed, drunken look about her. She was limping and coughing, shielding her eyes against the sunlight. "Stop there," Shaw heard one of the soldiers say. The woman did as she was told. "Take off your clothes." The woman hesitated, and Shaw heard a soldier give the order to push her back through the gate.
"No,"
she said, raising her palms at them in a gesture of surrender.
"Okay."
She began to undress. She untucked her blouse and started to fumble with the buttons. She seemed to be having a great deal of difficulty. From the stiffness of her movements, Shaw guessed she'd been badly hurt, and recently, too. The woman wasn't making much progress on the buttons. She had to stop every few seconds to cough, and from the way she was swaying on her feet, Shaw thought she might fall over at any movement. One of the soldiers gave an order Shaw couldn't hear, and another soldier came up behind her and yanked her blouse off. She wasn't wearing a bra, and she stood there, trembling, looking scared and small and helpless. Her back was laced with cuts, and there was a large, festering wound between her shoulder blades that looked to Shaw to be a bite mark. The soldier who had pulled off her blouse turned her around to show the injury to his superior, and it was then that Shaw got a look at the woman's face. Her eyes had turned bloodshot,
and were lost in the black shadows that spread up from her cheeks. Her lips were cracked and pale, and when she coughed, he could see black bits of bloody phlegm fly out of her mouth. The woman was changing right in front of him, becoming one of those zombies. Her hand had been across her breasts, but it was slipping away now. She shook her head as though there were no seams biting at her cheeks, but it was a dreamy sort of gesture, and one she evidently couldn't control. She staggered once, righted herself, and began to moan. Slowly, laboriously, she turned toward the soldiers and raised her hands, clutching at them. "Do it," Shaw heard one of the soldiers say, and the next instant the woman's body was bouncing and jittering as the bullets slammed into her chest. She landed on her butt, her shoulders sagging, arms limp at her side, her legs out in front of her like a child sitting on the grass. Her face was flecked with blood. Her mouth tried to move, but at that instant the soldiers fired again, and she was laid flat under a hail of automatic weapons fire. At the same time, the sound of gunfire sent a wave of panic through the assembled refugees. People were screaming, running away from the gate, creating a backward surge that collided with the others farther back in line, who were pushing forward to see what the commotion was all about. Shaw watched people trample each other. A man was thrown off the side of the highway. Still others, in the drive to escape, were throwing punches at those who blocked them. The soldiers, too, were on edge, for many of them spun around to face the crowd, their weapons up and ready. "Cease fire!" Shaw screamed at the soldiers. "Stop it!" He pulled his badge from his belt and held it up high as he advanced on the chain-link fence. "Don't you dare shoot!" he said. "Lower your weapons! Put them down!" The soldiers didn't move. They were nervous. Even behind their gas masks, Shaw could tell they were green troops, not veterans. One of the soldiers pointed a trembling M16 at him. Shaw slapped the chain-link fence and made the man jump. "Lower your weapon, now!" The soldier lowered his rifle a little and looked around for someone to tell him what to do. "You!" Shaw said to the soldier. "Get your commanding officer up here right now. I need to talk to him. Move!" The man took a few steps back and yelled, "Colonel Adams!" A man on the far side of the second fence came forward. "Sir," the soldier said, "I need you up here, Colonel." Shaw waited as the man approached. Shaw's presence in front of the soldiers had eased the tension somewhat. No longer were refugees screaming in retreat. Many were keeping their distance, but all were turned his way, watching nervously. A few brave individuals even walked toward the gate, but the sight of the dead woman, her skull ruptured and her brains splattered across the pavement, kept them quiet. Only the soldiers remained on edge. They kept their weapons trained on Shaw and on the crowd behind him. The ranking officer stepped forward, suited and gas-masked like the others, and stood on the other side of the fence from Shaw. "You the man in charge?" Shaw asked. "That's right. I'm Dr. Robert Adams, U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases." Shaw thought, active duty man. That's good. But he also noticed the man referred to himself as doctor and not colonel. Military doctors were like that. They didn't think of themselves as soldiers first and foremost, but as doctors who had to wear a uniform every once in a while. He said, "Dr. Adams, this is not working." "Who are you?" Adams said. "My name is Mark Shaw. I'm the director of the Houston Police Department's Emergency Operations Command and the overall incident commander for the police department. I brought these refugees here so that—" "Mr. Shaw, I appreciate—" "No," Shaw said. "No, I don't want to hear your platitudes, Doctor. I'm telling you that we have to find a better way to get these people through. The water's deep out there right now, but when it gets dark and the tide ebbs, we're going to get the infected swarm in this area in droves. These people will be sitting ducks up here, Adams crossed his arms over his chest, his plastic suit crinkling audibly. "I have my orders, Mr. Shah. This is the way my commanders have told me to get this thing done. We cannot allow any infected persons out of the city. The risk is too great." "I'm not asking you to let any of the infected through," Shah said, forcing himself to remain calm. A vision of Brent getting torn apart by those zombies flared up in his mind, but he forced that away too. "I know how dangerous the infected are, Dr. Adams. We've been fighting them continuously for the last 2 days. All I'm asking you to do is help me find a way to help these people." "That's what I'm trying to do," Adams said. "Have you talked to them? Have you sent your men out of these gates to explain to them what's going on, what they'll be expected to do when they get up here?" Adams hesitated, then said, "No, I haven't. But I'm not going to send my men out there. I have orders about that, too." "Okay," Shah said. "I have officers out here. Let them do it." "We can do that," Adams said. "Sure, we can allow that." "Good. I'll bring several of my men up here. Can you get one of your officers to brief them? Once they know what to say, I'll send them down the line here." "Absolutely." "And Dr. Adams." "Yes?" "It would help these people a lot if you could feed them. Do you have any rations I could pass out?" "Yes, we'll do that too. Is there anything else?" "Yeah. When nightfall comes, things are going to get ugly back there." He pointed over his shoulder to the south. "Most of my men are out of ammunition. We need rifles and bullets." "Oh, I don't know about that," Adams said. "My orders are—" "Doctor, please, I'm begging you. At least help me give these people a fighting chance. I need rifles, ammunition, binoculars if you've got them, flashlights." "I don't—" "It'll be just for your men, right? Not regular civilians?" "That's right." Adams let out a long sigh. "Okay," he said, with the air of a man who was about to get himself fired. "I'll see what I can do." "Thank you," Shah said. "At this point, every little bit counts." Chapter 17. Eleanor and her family didn't really get to know any of the Red Cross volunteers with whom they were traveling. There were passing comments made back and forth, the usual pleasantries between amicable strangers, and several of the women even complimented Eleanor on having such a beautiful daughter. But there was never more than that. They just never gelled. Eleanor and her family felt tacked onto the group, and not really part of it. She and Jim dealt mainly with Hank. He became the bridge between the two groups, and everybody seemed fine with that arrangement. There was a general understanding, after all, that they were together only until they got out of the city. Still, Hank's relationship with the volunteers wasn't all that perfect either. One of the volunteers, the ex-Marine named Frank Miller, who had been so helpful while they were escaping the Meadowlarks Business Park, seemed to rankle at Hank taking the leadership role. There were never any harsh words spoken between them, but Eleanor was a good judge of body language, and she could tell there was tension between the two men. And judging from the fact that both were professional soldiers, trained to be leaders during combat situations, it wasn't hard to gauge the weather between them. After they left the EOC, Eleanor became acutely aware of the strained, tightly wound bearing the men had when in close company, the stiff, almost ritualistic civility between them. Jim picked up on it too. Someone on the inside looking in, he said, would probably think them the best of buddies. Hank made it a point to solicit Frank's opinion on which way to go. Frank carried one of Hank's pistols, and sometimes, when zombies would emerge from the houses they passed, Hank would give the shot to Frank. They were like a talented first lieutenant and his grizzled veteran platoon sergeant, trying desperately for the sake of their charges to make it look like everything was fine. Frank Miller, especially, tried to maintain a dignified air. But the resentment was there, the elephant in the room that nobody wanted to acknowledge. Something had to give,
And around midday it did. Hank stopped the group for lunch. Frank approached him, and the two men paddled a short ways off, stopping their canoes under the covered drive-through awning of a Jack-in-the-Box, arguing in hushed tones. Afterwards, Hank didn't speak. He seemed to almost shrink up within himself. He spent a good 30 minutes watching the wilderness that the city had become. The vast expanse of the floodwaters seemed to hold him enthralled, and the deeply thoughtful bearing he assumed made him seem, to Eleanor at least, as darkly handsome as any man outside a movie had a right to look. But by the time they resumed their course after lunch, Frank Miller and a few of the others were gone. Eleanor thought Hank would lose it. Maybe, in his anger, he would yell at those who remained with him, demand to know if any of the others wanted to strike out on their own, too. But he didn't. He remained calm, almost stoic, and when it came time to move out, outwardly at least, he seemed the same old, solidly reliable Hank Gleason, SWAT officer extraordinaire. But when Eleanor tried to find out what happened, all he would say is, "They are gone." Nothing more. She never learned exactly what they'd argued about, and she never saw Frank Miller or any of the ones who left with him again. They just disappeared into the flooded city, and it became one of the many unresolved questions that the Houston disaster created. It was nearly 8 o'clock when they made it to the Beltway. Dusk was settling over the city, throwing whole streets and the spaces between buildings into dangerous shadow. The water was receding, too, leaving behind the stink of chemicals and mud and rotted bodies. It wouldn't be long, Eleanor figured, before the vast sea that surrounded them would be shallow enough to allow the zombies easy movement. There would be trouble later. But for now, there was work to do. From the water, they could see the huge line of refugees waiting to pass through the military checkpoint. They could see boats of every description clustered around the on-ramps to the freeway. And, in the distance, they could see the wall the military was building around the city. "What do you suppose they're doing?" Jim asked. They were coasting up to the on-ramp now, looking for a way up. "Medical screening, I guess," Eleanor answered. "Because of the zombies?" "Well, yeah," she said. "You think they have a cure or something?" "I don't think they have a cure," she said. She pointed over to the far side of the Beltway. There were several bodies, perhaps 6 or 7 in all, together in a heap. Even from a distance she could tell they'd been shot multiple times. "Oh," he said. "Wow." "Yeah, I know. I just can't believe it's come to this." The group slid up to the freeway on-ramp and climbed out of their canoes. Eleanor helped Madison into her backpack, and then turned around so Jim could help her with hers. It was the last real intimate family moment they had, for at that moment Hank came up to her and asked her what she wanted to do. She understood right then that he was relinquishing his role as leader. He had got them this far, shepherded them through the war zone, and now it was her turn to lead. She was a police supervisor again. The group of volunteers gathered around them. Eleanor watched their faces, and she could tell they were waiting for her to tell them what to do. "Well, this is it," she said. "Once we get up top, we're going to have to fit into whatever plan the military has got in place. I don't know what that's going to be, but I'm pretty sure they're going to need some help on this side of the checkpoint. I can't make you guys do anything, though. You don't work for me. If you want to get in line with everyone else, I understand." "We came down here to help," one of the men said. Several of the others spoke up in agreement. Nobody, as far as Eleanor could tell, was ready to quit. "If there's something for us to do up there," another man said, "we'll do it. We're in it for keeps." "Excellent," she said, and sincerely meant it. They were quite a crew, these Red Cross volunteers, and at that moment she regretted not taking the time to get to know them better. These people had backbone.
Okay, then. If you guys are ready.
They nodded back at her, and she put an arm around Madison's shoulder, and together they walked up the on-ramp. But when they reached the top of the ramp and saw the line of refugees, and the barely restrained bedlam of wailing babies, and sick, scared people, and the occasional fighting, Eleanor's confidence wavered.
"Oh, my God,"
one of the volunteers said. Eleanor saw an older black officer she recognized from the EOC, and asked him to bring her up to speed. He explained that Captain Shaw was up front, where the military was feeding people through the medical checkpoint one at a time. The remaining officers from the EOC, and Eleanor gasped when he told her there were only 6 of them left, were working up and down the line, trying to keep order, finding lost kids, answering questions.
"They want us looking for people who might be infected, too," he said, and gestured uneasily toward his rifle. "Please tell me you're joking," she said. "They expect you to—"
"It's already happened a couple of times. Not in my section, but it's happened. I got my eye on about 20 different folks in my area. Hopefully they're okay, but I got my doubts."
"This is insane," Eleanor said.
"Yes, ma'am," the officer agreed. "It is at that."
"Where'd you say Captain Shaw was again?"
The officer gestured toward the checkpoint.
"Okay," she said. "I appreciate it."
Ma'am?"
"Yes?"
He pointed toward Jim and Madison.
"Ma'am, if you don't mind me saying, you should probably get your family set up somewhere over here in my section. I can get them worked in without creating too much of a hassle."
Eleanor smiled.
"I appreciate that, officer, but I can't do that. It wouldn't be fair."
"Ma'am," he said, "you don't understand. It's taken them about 20 minutes per person to get these folks through that checkpoint up there. And as you can see—"
He gestured toward the back of the line. It stretched at least a mile down the length of the elevated roadway. There were literally thousands of people waiting back there.
"With the sun going down and low tide coming, those zombies are going to be storming our location, and I don't know how long we can hold them off. Most of those people back there, they're probably not going to live to see the morning."
Eleanor looked back at Jim and Madison, her gaze lingering on her daughter. The girl was dripping wet. It made her seem too skinny, too small, too fragile.
"Ma'am," the officer said, "this ain't no time to be playing fair."
Eleanor nodded.
"Thank you," she said. "I'm sorry, I'm terrible with names."
"Garrity," he said. His smile was kind. Exhausted, but kind.
"Thank you, Garrity. I mean it. Thank you."
Eleanor turned to Jim and Madison.
"I want you guys to go with him. He's going to set you up with a place here." "Mommy, no!"
"Where are you going to be?" Jim asked her.
"It's okay," Eleanor said to Madison. "I'm going to be right here in this area. I'll come by as often as I can and check in. You just